Welcome back. A medical cannabis group, Cilo Cybin, has halted the production and supply of its CBD range for the South African market. This amid continued regulatory challenges over the trade in cannabis in the country. The company, which listed on the JSE's alternative exchange in June last year, is now focused on exporting its CBD products to Australia and countries such as Germany. Cilo Cybin CEO Gabriel Theron joins us with more insights on the company's ambitions. Thank you so much for your time, Gabriel. Of course, that is one of the points that we will be focusing on. But really, this conversation is about the journey that you have taken thus far, particularly in the public market. So really the journey of listing being an interesting one. Last week we were actually talking about a company that moved from the Alt-X to the JSE's main board. I do understand in the middle of last year, I think if I remember correctly, Cilo Cybin entered the Alt-X. Talk to me about what kind of anchorage you found, listing on the Alt-X.
Good evening, and thank you for making time for me tonight. So, yes, I think first of all we need to understand what exactly did we list. So we list what we call a SPAC vehicle, or a special purpose acquisitions company. And think of it as a fund. So this fund needs to go out and look for assets to acquire. And in that process of acquiring those assets, they basically de-SPAC, so they come off that naming, or the JSE don't name it as a SPAC anymore, and it becomes a live trading entity on the JSE. We are currently, as a SPAC, you're also live trading. We are on the Alt-X, but it changes slightly when you're no longer your operating entity. A SPAC is not considered as an operating entity. So we've listed that in middle last year, with then the target thereafter is to de-SPAC. So that's your first target, is to de-SPAC and become a fully trading and operating entity on the JSE. And we're in that process. We put out a communication end of December to notify the shareholders that we are working on something. And we, at the end of the day, is basically we're just following the last regulatory processes, and then we will take something to the shareholders to decide on.
All right. Well, I mean, a SPAC, listing as a SPAC, of course, as you say, means that you are going out to buy other companies. What is that acquisition pipeline looking like?
So what we've done, which was slightly different to most SPACs, sometimes a SPAC, people raise funds with they know in which industry they want to go and participate and look for assets, but they don't really have a target in mind. In our case, it was slightly different. We already had a target in mind, which was our own operating entity, also called Cilo Cybin Pharmaceutical. So it changed that narrative slightly, because we always said we're going to list this entity. We were funded or backed by a Malaysian pharmaceutical, and the plan was to get onto the Alt-X with a SPAC, and then to go and acquire ourselves, our operating entity, and then from there to scale the business and grow it into an international, fully fledged business.
Well, actually, what will be the trigger for the move then from the Alt-X to the main board?
So the JSE has very set guidelines, but to make it simple, they say your share capital needs to be more than 500 million, and you need to be more than 15 million profit to qualify for a main board listing. So those two criteria, if we meet those, then we can transition from an Alt-X to a main board listing.
And actually, how have you gauged investor appetite? Because I mean, I feel like you're providing kind of alternative medicinal products from, the pharmaceutical companies that we are used to. So I'm just wondering if you have seen a rapid investor appetite there, or maybe it's moving more gradually, and maybe partly because people still need to understand the role of cannabis in the medical space.
Yes, I think the world's also in a very different place than, call it 5 or 10 years ago, where you used to have these main anchor clients or main investors or anchor investors to come in that takes up quite a substantial portion of your business, and you have them as you go and you grow. what we've seen also in terms of our case, our main backers, except for our main backing company out of Malaysia, has been the retail market.
Okay.
So I believe that the retail market is, what we can see is, it's the people that take their health into their own hands. And I think a lot of people believe in cannabis and they can see where cannabis is going. And it will take some time maybe for the bigger funds to trust cannabis as a viable business to look at. But if you look at what's happening in the cannabis space, yes, originally there was a couple of companies that raised a lot of funds. I'm talking 5-10 years ago, or 5-6 years ago, and they didn't do so well overseas. But what we've seen now is the market started maturing, and you're seeing companies hitting all-time records in terms of growth. All sectors combined, cannabis companies are hitting the targets as some of the fastest growing companies in revenue of all time. So you can see there's been a shift. Yes, it was a rocky start for a lot of people in the cannabis industry. But we can see there's a big change, and there's momentum definitely out of a lot of countries globally and even locally. We can see there's a lot of momentum here from government side, looking at how do we legalize it, how do we get people to legally buy in South Africa. So I think from that perspective, the market is huge. I think the opportunity is massive. And from our perspective, we believe we are very well positioned to take full advantage of that.
Well, I mean, talking about, maturity, because there also needs to be maturity in the regulatory space as well. And Cilo Cybin has really had many firsts in the South African cannabis space. Obviously, as much as there are many opportunities, there are also lots of challenges there, considering that you have been the first in a lot of regulatory breakthroughs. Just talk to me about the major challenges that you are encountering here and really how you're navigating that regulatory landscape.
Look, I think, to be honest with you, the regulatory environment matures as the industry matures. I think nobody knew how to handle this thing called cannabis from a regulatory point of view, whether it was medicinal or not. And I think we're finding our feet very well in that space. And you can see there's momentum. We decriminalized private use last year. And now it's basically, if you're talking South African terms, how do we create an environment where we can legally sell? So the playing field matures, and with that, the companies that's in the space finds it more easier to penetrate into the market, because when we started, there was no market. We had our license, we had everything in play, but there was no market to sell to, and we had to wait. So those days are over. Now it's a question of how fast can you actually get yourself up and running, get your quality to a certain level, because this is all measured according to pharmaceutical standards. And for anybody that comes from any other industry, not from the pharmaceutical industry, it's a very big adjustment to move from normal manufacturing into, I call it, a pharmaceutical manufacturing standard. So those are one of your biggest challenges. Funding, huge challenge in this space, because it does not come easy, because you need to compete at a very, very high, call it a pharmaceutical level. The skill sets that you need to bring on board is very expensive. The equipment is expensive. The licensing is expensive. So, and then you have things like a long pipeline. Once you have everything set up, you have your licenses, you find your customers, but it also takes some time to onboard them from order to when you get your first check in the bank, can be 3 to 6 months. So cash flow is always a big problem in this space. So there's a couple of things, but regulatory environment in terms of trade, I think it's quite clear. In terms of exporting, it's whether you can meet that standard is one of the biggest challenges.
Well, you have jumped through a lot of hurdles, and here is to continuing the journey with you as you reach many milestones as your vision progresses and matures. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights today, Gabriel. That was Gabriel Theron, CEO for Cilo Cybin.